Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Future of Oceans. My name is Betsy Carlson. I am the Citizen Science Coordinator at the Port Townsend Marine Science Center. And I am filling in for Diane Quinn, who is a much better juggler than I am. And she will be back in the future. So I also wanted to point out that I'm wearing some of Nam Siu original design. Not as original as his, because that's a one of, but you can get these at the Marine Science Center gift shop. So that's a little plug for that. And I also want to acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional lands and waters of the many coastal Salish peoples, particularly the Sklallam people, the strong people. We respect and are grateful for this land, these waters, and the people who have inhabited them since time immemorial, and who continue to steward the place for future generations. I also want to thank the Darrow family who fund this lecture series and are very involved with the selection of the speakers. So thank you, Susie and Dan Darrow, and there's an anonymous Darrow in the house. Kathy back there. With that, I get to introduce Nam. Nam is a true thalassophile, if I didn't kill that. A lover of oceans. So I've learned a new word in the fact of having to introduce this today. I appreciate that. Nam is a local biologist, an avid surfer and diver, and an artist. And I've got to first meet Nam when he was helping out at the Jefferson Community School, which used to be downtown Port Townsend. And he would take kids out, and so he was doing his environmental education gig with those kids, and I remember them loving it very much. And then recently, as he was part of the Jefferson Marine Resources Committee, and so I also got to work with him there, and his thoughtful and passionate insights were highly valued on that committee. He still is part of that committee, he just doesn't know it. And he's a longtime friend of the Marine Science Center. He's served on the board and has assisted us with some citizen science projects. So we're always grateful for Nam's help and what he's contributed both scientifically, artistically, and to our greater community. So thank you, Nam. And other people recognize Nam. In 2022, he was selected as Washington Sea Grant's featured local artist. So that's pretty cool. And I think if you take up music, I want you to name your band Algal Rhythms. I'll get credit for that. All right, so please join me in welcoming Nam Siu and exploring the confluence of art and science.
Okay, can you all hear me? I'm going to take the mic with me because I tend to be a pacer. Well, thank you for that great introduction, Betsy, and thank you all for braving the weather to be here today. Thalassophilic Impressions, Nautical Pursuits, Ocean Conservation, and the Confluence of Science and Art. That's quite a title, right? They're pretty campy, too. Well, you can thank ChatGPT for that, for helping me come up with that one. You see, to be honest, a couple of months ago when I was asked to give this talk, I was surprised, honored, don't get me wrong, but I was totally flabbergasted. I mean, a majority of the previous speakers were all PhDs, experts in their respective fields, giving talks, inspiring talks about how they were saving the ocean. And now here I am talking to you all about my little art hobby. And so at least that's how I felt a couple months ago when I was first asked to give this talk. And certainly at that time, I didn't know how I was going to, what I was going to talk about, just something along the lines of my work in science and some of my art. And all they needed was a title. So that takes me to how I used AI to come up with this long, campy title. But it was a couple of weeks ago when it dawned on me, a couple of weeks ago when I was still panicking about what I was going to talk about, that it dawned on me, I'm going to take a step back here. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to me using AI to come up with this long, campy title. Despite of being an artist, I still sometimes don't feel very creative. In fact, some of you might have heard me say, some of those of you who know me might have heard me say in the past that I don't actually create any art, I feel. Sometimes I feel like that it's nature that creates the art, and I just try my best to capture what nature has already perfected. And so, with that in mind, a couple of weeks ago when I was panicking, trying to think of a talk that would be worthy of this long title, a talk that would be worthy of being amongst the previous inspirational talks by all the other folks that have come before me, it all kind of dawned on me then that it was actually my love and study of the ocean that inspired me to want to capture and recreate and share with everybody what I was seeing and what I was learning. And it was that pursuit of art that drove me to dive deeper into the ocean, metaphorically and literally. It was that pursuit of art that got me creative. And so I really hope that this talk also helps inspire you and will help inspire you to take a little deeper dive into your connection with the ocean, whether that be science, art, or conservation, or all of the above. So with that all said, and my long campy title explained, I like to start by going all the way back to the beginning. The start of my thalassophilia, my love of the ocean. It's pretty simple. I've lived around the oceans all my life, whether that was, where I was born in Hong Kong or where I later immigrated to in Vancouver, BC, or where I further even later moved to in Tampa Bay area, Florida. I lived around the water all my life, and as any of you who know me knows that I spend most of my free time on or under the water. And it was during my upbringing, living in all these areas and around the ocean that really sparked my interest in the ocean. And it was during all this time that moving from place to place where I really noticed differences in the various shorelines where I was living. Differences in the plants on the shorelines, differences of the shells on the beach, differences of the fish that I was catching or seeing underwater. And not only did I notice, growing up in all these areas, that there were differences in the flora or fauna of the different ecosystems, I also noticed similarities. I noticed that, despite of these different shorelines being in different geographic areas, there are similar niches or similar ecological functions that were there. There were producers, there were consumers, there were predator, prey, and all of the above. It's just that all of the different functions, all of the different niches were played by different organisms in these different areas. So it really was that observation of, similarities and differences growing up that really sparked my interest in the oceans and inspired me to go on to study marine ecology. Some of you might say, well, gee, Nam, as a 5-year-old or 8-year-old over here, how were you already thinking about, these different similarities and differences? And admittedly, I will tell you that I watched a lot of BBC nature documentaries growing up. In fact, one other, early memory I want to share with all of you is distinctly remembering at the age of 5, when I was still in Hong Kong and watching BBC's Blue Planet, the second episode, The Deep. Some of you might even remember this. This was a formative memory. I still distinctly remember it. And up until that point, I always wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to go into outer space and find bizarre alien worlds and discover alien life. It all hit me like a ton of bricks when I watched that episode of BBC Blue Planet, The Deep, that I didn't have to travel into outer space to find alien life forms. There are plenty of unexplored areas of our ocean and plenty of alien life in the oceans that I could explore in these alien habitats and hydrothermal vents and methane seeps, chemosynthetic ecosystems. And so from that point on, as a 5-year-old, I decided that I wanted to be a marine biology. And again, certainly moving around the world and living in different shorelines did not hurt. And so with that all said, moving on from my early childhood into my early education and career, from then on, I decided to pursue science. I spent a lot of that time learning the art of science. I went on to study marine science and biology at the University of Tampa in Florida, and further, as a result of an internship, ended back here in the Pacific Northwest at Western Washington University doing my graduate work in oceanography. And throughout all this time, I was very science focused. I didn't think that I even throughout my studies, I didn't think I had a creative bone in my body at all. But it's something that I was learning there was that there was an art to the science of the oceans. And this is a quote from a interview I gave for KPTZ earlier this week, and I really loved it. And so I'm going to say it again here. And that I feel that there is an art to the science of the oceans. There is an art in designing these scientific questions, these hypotheses. And there was an art to designing experiments or experimental contraptions or apparatus to answer those questions. So, for those of us who actually work in science, and not just study it, you realize that in order to answer these questions, you actually have to be pretty creative. You have to, use your creative juices, and as I often said in the lab, MacGyver your experimental setup and apparatus to make it work. So here are just some pictures of some of my science career. Something I'm going to talk about more is how I was a scientific scuba diver for a number of years, spending time underwater, looking at plants underwater. I'll talk about that a little more later. But one thing I want to share is that, going back to my story about watching BBC's Blue Planet, the episode of The Deep, and wanting to study alien life forms at the deep sea ecosystems, is that I want to share one big coming full circle moment for me in my early career, and that when I was lucky enough to work as an intern and later on as a science manager for Dr. Bob Ballard on the research vessel Nautilus for Ocean Exploration Trust. For those of you who don't know, Bob Ballard is the guy that rediscovered the wreck of the Titanic, amongst other famous wrecks. And more importantly for me as a biologist, he was one of the team members of the original team that first discovered hydrothermal vents back in the 80s. Hydrothermal vents on the mid-Atlantic ridge in the middle of the Atlantic. And so for me, it was a real big coming full circle moment to get to not only do this cool work that I dreamt about as a 5-year-old, but to work shoulder and shoulder with one of my childhood heroes. And so one of those big inspiring moments for me. Nevertheless, throughout, interspersed with my early science career, I did a handful of environmental education jobs. Education has always been a big passion of mine, and as Betsy has mentioned, I have partaken in some of those activities in town here. And what's interesting is that it's one of those side gigs that landed me here in Port Townsend. For a short stint, for a season, I worked as an environmental educator on a sailboat, 61-foot wooden yawl by the name of the good ship Carlin. The organization I worked for then was Salish Sea Expedition, and funny enough, they also landed here in Port Townsend recently at the Maritime Center. Although when I worked for them, they were based out of Bainbridge, and it was, Port Townsend was simply a regular port of call that we came to a lot, and it was through a friend of mine who was the mate on the ship that got me a job in Port Townsend that allowed me to move here. And so I think that was kind of very fitting, given the maritime history and the sailing community here in Port Townsend, that I arrived here as a scientist under sail. And by moving here, I actually got to pursue and follow one of my other nautical pursuits, or childhood dreams, and that was buying and owning and living on my own sailboat. Here she is, a 27-foot Erickson named Marin of the Sea. In fact, this bottom photo is me and two of my friends transiting Marin from her previous port in Oak Harbor. So this is the picture that we took right as we were passing Point Wilson in the background there, as the sun was setting after a long transit through Deception Pass and down to Eastern Strait into Port Townsend. So that's what got me here. A sailboat literally got me here into Port Townsend. I lived on that sailboat for a year and a half before I gave that up and moved to be a landlubber. But what kept me here, what caused me to stay and settle and set roots down here, not just in Port Townsend, but on the greater Olympic Peninsula, is the wildlife and the abundance of natural resources and the beautiful ecosystems and just the beauty of nature that is out here on the Olympic Peninsula. As mentioned, and as any of you know who know a little about me knows, that I'm an avid watersman. I spend a lot of time in the water. I spend a lot of time on the water as well as underwater. But I also spend a lot of time harvesting and recreating and collecting the bounties of the ocean. And so that's one of the reasons why I decided to stay. And it's the primary reason why I decided later on and currently to decide to work for the state's Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife in order to help protect and perpetuate some of these natural resources of which I myself was a stakeholder of. You know, being someone who regularly goes out and enjoys these resources, harvests the bounty of the ocean, you know, I really wanted to find work that I can apply my experience in science and other experiences to help protect our resources. And, you know, WDFW is a place where I truly believe in the mission and am very passionate about their mission to preserve, protect, and perpetuate fish, wildlife, and ecosystems while providing sustainable fish and wildlife recreational and commercial opportunities. Again, I myself is a frequent partaker of those recreational opportunities. So I felt that it's very fitting that that is what I do now as a biologist for the state. This takes me to the first form of art that I practice in that I want to talk to you all about. And this art, you know, and the reason why I'm talking about this now is that this art form of algae pressing, originated as a science practice for me. As I mentioned, I worked as a scientific scuba diver. That was previous before working for the state. I spent a lot of time, about 4 years of my life doing this work, diving in the near-shore ecosystem of the Salish Sea, surveying specifically submerged aquatic vegetation. So that basically means seagrasses, algae, kelp, seaweeds. And I would spend about like 100 hours a year underwater doing this, just staring at the bottom, running along a transect and counting and cataloging all of the different seaweeds I saw. And so it was a result of that work that caused me to start taking on my algae pressing practice again. I think I spoke to one of the guests earlier in the room told me about how they also practice algae pressing, and it was an art they picked up in college in the phycology class. And I can relate to that because that's exactly where I learned how to do algae pressings. I learned how to do it as an undergrad in a phycology or seaweed class. And that was an art that I restarted upon doing my scientific scuba surveys in order to collect specimens that I didn't recognize or collect specimens that I do recognize and bring them home, identify them, press them, preserve them. And so I have a catalog of my own homemade identifying keys that I could bring out into the field. I literally would laminate these pressings and put them on a ring and go scuba diving with them. And certainly, when I first started doing these algae pressings in college, or when I first started doing it as a scientific scuba diver, I certainly appreciated the beauty of these specimens, but I honestly didn't really think about them as anything more than a scientific collection. And it wasn't later on until people were approaching me and saying, "Hey, this looks beautiful. Can I get a copy of this?" that I started doing this as an art form. And so I definitely didn't think I would still be doing algae pressings. You know, if you asked the college version of NAM, I definitely didn't think I would be doing it as an art form to this day. But I'm very happy to do so, and I'm happy to be here to talk to you all about it. And so one thing I will say, again, to reiterate, is that these algae pressings originated from a science practice. That's the science part of this art. You know, one of my favorite things to do in doing my algae pressings is the process of identifying or keying out that specimen that you have. That's where you initially learn a lot about what you're looking at. So, I would use dichotomous keys. I would use microscopy for the really fine algae to look at their growing tips to really try to figure out what they are. And honestly, that's a part of the fun. And it's not untypical of me to gift an algae pressing away without giving the ID of it, because I would gift it away and give you an ID guide and say, here's the fun, you get to ID it yourself. It's kind of a part of the process. It's the science process of this art. And so with that all in mind, I'll just say that when I do my algae pressings, one of the things that I really try to focus on, given that I started this as a science practice, is I try to capture the key identifying characteristics, the key characteristics or morphology of the specimen that I'm trying to press. For example, in this Halisacyon, the sea grape, of course, the key characteristic is this big air bladder, this pneumatocyst. And so when you think about that, in terms of algae pressing, when you think about these key identifying characteristics, you can't help but to think about the science of this art, the science of phycology in this art of algae pressing. And so here's another quote from my interview at KPTZ earlier this week. Again, I wanted to share this because after it rode off the tongue, it sounded great. So I'll say it again. Just as much as there is an art to the science of the oceans, I feel that there is also a science to the art of the ocean, and that science is in appreciating the design of nature's forms and how they've evolved to function in an aqueous environment. Very much so like this pneumatocyst, how it's designed, I will say design loosely, that implies there was some kind of thought process. It's all random evolution, right? But just these designs of nature and how they function, such as this air bladder to help keep this algae afloat. And similarly, here is another one of my algae pressings of another specimen that's probably more well recognized. This is a bow kelp, Nereocystis leuciana. And here is another algae, specifically a kelp that also has a pneumatocyst, an air bladder that helps it float above everything else, except this is a canopy forming kelp. Most of you have seen this washed up at North Beach or maybe even in the bay itself. And it's able to get above everything else with the help of this long stipe. So, as you do these algae pressings, you are learning a lot about the science and the morphology of these seaweeds and the different form and function of their morphology. And similarly, another example here is the giant kelp, Macrocystis peripherea. This is another canopy-forming kelp. It also has these pneumatocysts, these little air bladders, except it's organized in a very different way. And although it's another canopy-forming kelp, it's very different. And so these similarities and differences still kind of peek out in these pressings, and you learn about them as you do them. Something else, another way the art of science or the science is infused in this art is that not only when I do my pressings, I try to capture those key identifying characteristics, I often try to capture any interesting or significant points of its development. So I typically would, because of the process and whatnot, I typically will try to grab younger specimens, because you've seen how big a bow kelp is, right? Imagine trying to press a full specimen. So I usually try my best to grab younger specimens. This is a pretty small one. This is the grown tip of a giant kelp. But in doing so, you also get to capture some really cool key developmental stages of these organisms, of these algae. For example, in this giant kelp on the left here, you see what is in focus here is the apical meristem, or the grown tip of this giant kelp. It is commonly known as a scimitar blade. That big curve gives it its name. A scimitar is a sword from the Middle East. It's a curved sword, and it's where it's the common name of that apical meristem is derived from. What's really cool is if you look at that growing tip, that apical meristem, you see that every following blade is derived or differentiating off of that main blade. This is how this species specifically grows. So one key step in its development shown here, whereas in contrast here for this bow kelp, for this Nereocystis leuciana, you see that its blades actually grow very differently. It doesn't grow at a tip, it actually originates at the bulb. The separation of each blade happens here, and a suture line develops along the blade. You can see it just starting to split on that upper blade, but even the attachment points of each blade is starting to separate. So this is a young specimen of the bow kelp, and here what is captured in this pressing is it's starting to grow new blades and split. And so very interesting points. As you do these seaweed pressings, again, there's a lot of science to it. There's a lot that you can learn about your subject matter. Similarly, along those lines, you find out other things about these seaweeds. For example, here are two specimens of the same genus, Prionitis. They're both beach reeds, but you can see they look very different. However, if you actually zoom in really close on this specimen, you see what some of the structures here actually look a lot like this one here. And so what other aspect of seaweeds I've learned is that they exhibit a high degree of phenotypic plasticity. Crickets. How many of you actually know what phenotypic plasticity means? Right, quite a few of you, great, awesome. I know this is a science-focused audience, but phenotypic plasticity, for those of you who are not familiar, is just the ability for an organism to change its form as a result of environmental cues. So this is very typical in seaweed and kelp. They live in various degrees of exposure to currents, to wave energy, and as a result of that, they will change their form in order to best survive in that environment. And so these two specimens, although they are in the same genus, and then sometimes I might even argue they might be the same species, maybe, come talk to me afterwards, they were found in very different environments. That's something, again, another core science, ecological fact that you learn doing these algae pressings. Moving on, another way science comes into these algae pressings is that you learn about these really cool associations between epiphytic seaweed and their host seaweed. Epiphytic seaweed simply just means seaweed that grows on the epidermis, on the outside of other seaweeds. They're epiphytes. For example, here you have the epiphytic Microcladia coulteri on a specimen of that bleachweed that we just talked about, Prionitis. On the left, you have the wet sample before pressing, and on the right, you have the pressed sample here. But again, what's really cool is you learn about these associations, and what you learn is that some of these species of seaweed, especially the fine lacy red ones like this, Savoria robusta on the giant kelp blade, you find that some of them are almost exclusively epiphytes, so they need to grow on something else. And what more you learn is that some of them are exclusive epiphytes of other specific species, so there are very close interactions and associations that some only grows on a specific other species of seaweed. So these are all really cool science facts that you learn as you do this art form of seaweed pressing, and it's just another way to understand and appreciate and share this knowledge about the ocean. Just a couple of more examples of my algae pressings before we move on. These are just some photos of some of my favorite specimens I've pressed. Here's the Optunella californica, beautiful polka dot seaweed, I call it, just because of the blades are all circular. This is one of my favorites, Kumathion decipiens, formerly known as Deliceria decipiens. Yeah, as a part of doing this, you learn a lot about their taxonomy and how a lot of their names keep changing over and over again. But this one is especially, one that I really love just because of its morphology. You can see that each new blade comes off of the midrib of the former blade. And so you have the big one here with a medium blade coming off, and then you have these smaller blades coming off of that medium one. And if you haven't caught on already, for kelp and seaweed, a blade is the leaf, analogous to a leaf of land plants. What's also really cool about this species is you can see these little dark dots. That's I believe, where it's starting to reproduce and produce spores. So again, capturing another really cool key life stage of these seaweeds. In these examples here, we have two Desmarestiids, Desmarestia languillata and Desmarestia viridius. These Desmarestiids are known as acid weed. And another cool thing you learn as you do this is, and you learn this very quickly, is that these are called acid weeds for a very good reason. If you collect any of these Desmarestias and put them in a bag, a sample bag with some of your other seaweeds, you will find that your other kelp and seaweed will bleach very quickly because of the acidity of this one. So, whenever I collect these, I definitely collect it separate. But they are absolutely beautiful. The common name for this one is witch's hair. Really nice. And again, a couple more examples of my favorite ones. This is the red sea oak, Eurythrophyllum delicerioides, and then Rhodoptilium plumusum, one of my absolute favorite ones. This is, I don't think it has a common name, so I call it the red sea fern. As you can kind of guess where that came from. This is a beautiful specimen, except some of these really fine red ones take a long time to orient and lay out like this. This probably took me 45 minutes standing there with a toothpick, picking apart every single strand. Otherwise, it looks like a blob. And so a lot, in doing this, you get really close and you learn a lot about these seaweeds. I'm gonna end my talk about algae pressings for now with just a few more examples of my favorite ones. It's kind of no surprise that my favorite seaweeds to press are these fine lacy reds. They're just so intricate, they're beautiful, and they require high degree of detail, eye to detail, attention to detail in order to identify. And so they tend to be my favorite ones to press. I won't go over the genus species of every single one of these, but if you want to test me, again, come find me afterwards. You do this enough, you know them off the top of your head. So now I want to transition. Into talking about another art form that I practice. And in order to do so, I want to take a step back and go all the way back to the beginning. You remember one of the original reasons why I am the thalassophile, the ocean lover that I am, is because of the amount of time I spend in the water, just observing and just being there and appreciating what's there. And so I want to take you all there with me. This is some video I shot while freediving in the Strait a couple of years ago. I want to take you all there on this experience underwater. So please join me as we take a dive into the Strait. Okay, thank you all. Thank you all for joining me in that exercise. That was actually a relatively short breath hold. I think that clip was about 45 seconds long. By far not anything like record-breaking or anything, and I in no way, I'm no expert at this. I think my longest breath hold around here is maybe 1.5 to 2 minutes. 2 minutes maybe in tropical waters and not wearing a weight belt and wetsuit and all that, whatnot. But, that's how it's something I'm working on. In one way, I like to connect and get closer to the ocean. And so again, from that very beginning, it was my spending time in the water and seeing all these beautiful sights that you just saw in those videos that really inspired me to want to capture and share it with everybody. But it wasn't just that. Like I said, it was also my love for harvesting the bounty of the ocean. And so here is a picture of me that someone shot while I was out hunting for fish. And it was the collection of that bounty that really inspired me to take on this next art form of gyotaku. And so this fish is going to be my example for the upcoming slides. A friend of mine, Nate, was kind enough to document this process. He was very interested in documenting the entire harvest to print process, and that was something that we did this summer. And so, gyotaku is a Japanese art form, traditional Japanese art form. The word gyotaku, as you can imagine, is derived from Japanese. Gyo meaning fish, taku meaning rubbing, fish rubbing. This is a traditional Japanese art form that was started a couple hundred years ago by fishermen who wanted to record their catches. And certainly that's why I started doing it. I was catching all these fish and I wanted a way to record my trophies and memorialize them in a way that I could still use the fish, right? And so this process involves putting ink over a fish and laying a piece of paper or fabric over that fish and rubbing it to pull a relief impression. And after that, you can wash the fish off, wash the ink off, and you can fillet your fish and share it with everybody. But you still have this one print to forever remember and honor that fish that you caught. And so before I really dive deep with a narrative of that gyotaku process, I want to share this quote with you, that sight is just a remote form of touch. Think about that for a second. This is actually a quote that I stole from my college ceramics arts professor. Yeah, I said I went hard on science, through undergraduate and then grad school and then early career jobs, internships and whatnot. But one of the best things I've ever done for myself in my life was taking a ceramics class. It was in my senior year of college, and I was up to my eyeballs in a bunch of 400 level higher level science classes, super stressful. When I had a couple of extra credits, elective credits, that I decided to take ceramics, and it was the best thing. I thought I was just going to be there to de-stress and play with clay, like that scene in Ghosts and whatnot, and get to de-stress from my 400 level science classes, but I learned so much, and one of the things that I have learned that I've always held on to is this quote: sight is just a remote form of touch. I want you to think about that again. It's true. When you think about this carpet, when you think about seeing some of the tree bark outside on the trees, when you see that, you are imagining how it feels in your hand, right? When I look at your puffy coat, I'm imagining how that puffy feels, right? And it's so true. And it makes sense because sight is a later evolved sense, right? And touch came originally, even amoeba, with their pseudopodia are reaching out, touching the world, feeling the world around them. And so it makes sense that our sense of sight is related to that ancestral ancient form of sensing, touch. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we go over and think about my gyotaku pressings. I hope that everybody gets that feeling when they look at one of my prints, that not only do they see it, but when they see the detail on it, they imagine how that fish feels, the scaliness of that fish, or rather the sliminess of that fish. So with that in mind, let's talk about the gyotaku process. Like I said, a fish is laid out. Typically, you pin the fins open in an open orientation, or whatever orientation you want to capture. You put something in its mouth to keep it open, or in the orientation that you want. And then you apply the ink. And from that point on, here's another interactive activity on my talk. I'm going to ask you all to join me here and maybe even close your eyes if it helps you focus or imagine. But I'm going to ask you to imagine doing this process with me. It's a very intimate and close process, all right? You just laid your fabric over this fish, and now you are feeling the fish head to tail. Every square millimeter of this fish you are going to feel and touch with your hands. And as you do so, you feel the fabric get wet with the transfer of that ink. You can literally feel that in your hands. And as you do that, you are running your fingers over every scale and every ray of every fin of this fish. You're taking your fingertips and you are pressing into every nook and cranny of this fish to try to pull the most detail you can off of this print. And so, like I said, hopefully you are imagining, feeling, and getting close and personal with your specimen, this fish. It's a very close and intimate process, and it's very much like my algae pressings. Okay, you get to know the specimen very well. You get to know the key identifying characteristics. You get to know why it's named for its namesake, really, and we'll talk about that. So thank you. You can open your eyes if your eyes are still closed. Thank you for going along there with me. So once you've rubbed that fish top to bottom, then comes the moment of magic. I call this the Christmas morning moment. This is the moment where you get to open your gifts Christmas morning that you've been so excited about. This is the reveal moment, because every time you do this, it's a little bit different. And you never know how it's going to turn out. It might work really well, or it might not work at all. So this is the magic moment of the reveal. And here you have a rough draft of that print pulled out. Next, I go in and I finish the eyes, I add the detail, and I add my hanko or my seal, my stamp. You've been seeing that all along down here. This is my seal, my hanko, or in Chinese it's called yin. It's of kelp, just because I'm so inspired by kelp and my Chinese name here. And so once those final details are added, you have a finished print here. Some artists go in and add color afterwards. That's not something that I've gotten really interested in myself yet. And frankly, I really like the striking contrast of the black and white or the white on black here. Especially the white on black ones, I think they look like pirate flags with fish, so I like them. This is a specimen of a black rockfish, Sebaces melanops, beautiful specimen. And this was gifted to my friend Nate for documenting this process. Here are a series of other photos that my partner took. My partner is a professional photographer. Some of you might know her. She's a professional photographer in town. She owns Jen Lee Lights. But this is a series of photos that she took for me of me pulling a print off of this salmon, which is very appropriate because this actually was the first salmon she's ever caught. This was a coho she caught in Hood Canal earlier this year, Oncorhynchus kishich. And I had to share this print just because of the level of details you see on this one. As an artist, your practice is always evolving. You're always changing up your methods. And one change I made recently really allowed me to grab details from really, really fine scales. And so you can see that here. You can see every ray in their fin. You can see all of the lines in its gill and gill plates. You can even see some of the teeth there. And of course, the eye is drawn in afterwards. So Oncorhynchus kishich. Next, I have another video for you, another first. This is a video of that magic moment, that reveal that, again, my partner Jenny is helping me out here with this big tuna, albacore or longfin tuna caught off the coast of Washington State. This was a 25-pounder that we caught, also her first tuna. And so it's just so special to be able to capture and memorialize these great events, these firsts or these biggest or whatnot in this form. And yes, we were able to make poke out of this tuna afterwards. One of the great things about gyotaku. Here's the finished print, albacore tuna, Finis lunga. So a really nice print. And in the next slide, you can see some close-up details of the opposite color scheme of that print. I usually try to pull as many prints as I can, have energy for that night. Usually it's a race against time before the fish goes bad or before, because you're trying to use the meat as soon as you can afterwards. But you can see all of the rays in the dorsal fin here. You can see the fin nets on the peduncle of the tail, this characteristic tuna tail. And moreover, on the face, you can see the relief of the mouth parts. And I was particularly proud of that eye because it looks extra shiny and brilliant. Couple more examples of my gyotakus. This is of a giant Pacific octopus, Enteroctopus delphini. Beautiful specimen, different ways to present it in different color schemes. Absolutely beautiful. I actually really like this one because if you put a magnifying glass on one of the arms, it looks like the old PTMSC logo. The one right outside of the marine exhibit. Okay, a couple more examples here. Here are two black rockfish, Sebaces melanops. I really love doing multiple fish on one print, but the stakes get higher and higher because each time you do it, you might be off a little bit and you might ruin the previous print. But that one came out really well. Here we have a lingcod, Ophidiodon elongatus, the long cod. This is actually a print of my personal best lingcod I've harvested. And this was a 36-inch fish, so the print is actually not that much smaller than what you see here. And what was really cool is that that big belly had another lingcod in it, a 22-inch lingcod in the belly of this 36-inch lingcod. Here is another one that I really like, this pink salmon, Oncorhynchus gobushka. You can tell it's one of my earlier prints because the eye is not finished, but the reason why I wanted to share this again is because similar to my algae pressings, you learn about the key identifying characteristics of some of these species. Heck, in fact, you learn about the namesake of this species, this genus here, the Oncorhynchus. It means hooked nose, right? And if you see here on this spawning phase of this pink salmon, it's definitely got that exaggerated hooked nose as it's coming back to the rivers. And it's got that characteristic humpy that gives it its other common name, the humpy. Right, so absolutely beautiful specimen and way to present to its features. So fish is not the only type of thing you can print. Gyotaku, you can print just about anything your imagination allows you. There is a beautiful Humboldt squid back there that is hanging. Thank you, Libby, for bringing that specimen for us to see live. But you can print just about anything. I've seen some beautiful prints of leaves. I've seen someone print someone's face. You can print anything your mind can imagine, all right? But for me, I'm keeping with the ocean nautical theme. I moved on to shellfish, not that far of a leap, but for me, shellfish is something that's close and near and dear in my heart. And I was pleasantly surprised when I pulled a print off of this Pacific oyster, the Crassostrea megalana gigas, that the shell gave such good relief and such a detailed print. Just like you see in this generous clam or gooey duck, Panopia generosa. You can see every single line in its shell, almost like a tree and tree rings. And in fact, that's how you can date them. You can age them like that. And so you can actually, maybe off of this print, even age this clam. So quite a bit of detail. There's this cool little market squid just because I love cephalopods and they're so charismatic with all their arms and whatnot. I did try doing it with its ink. I did try extracting its ink sac and using its ink to do it, but it doesn't work very well. So this takes me to talking about how I moved on to combining my two loves for algae pressing and gyotaku and tried gyotaku and some kelp. That was kind of the next obvious evolution of my art. So here we have, again, the algae pressing of the specimen Neurocystis nucleana, the bull kelp. And here is a jumbled mess of that press, print that I pulled. And quite honestly, if you've been in the water with them, sometimes at different current conditions, they kind of look like this. And so, yeah. But what's really cool is when I took that technique and applied it to the giant kelp. You see here, and especially this white on black high contrast relief print, you actually captured a lot of the ridging pattern of the blades, which was lost in the kelp pressing. And so this different art form allowed us to focus on a different feature on this beautiful specimen. And of course, I had to put the fish and the kelp together. So here we have a kelp greenling in giant kelp, the Hexagamous decagamous in Macrocystis perifera. That's how you would naturally find them hanging out in the kelp forest there, and this is my best recreation of that. Here's an example, some close-up of the details of the opposite color scheme print that I've made. And one way I really like framing them is actually because they're on fabric, is actually stretch mounting them on a frameless, in a frameless way like canvas prints. And so that's all I'm gonna say about my gyotakus. In closing up here, I wanna share with you a couple of other ways I have used art to appreciate the ocean. I love harvesting uni. I love sea urchin. It's something that you can harvest pretty readily in a stray. It's really sustainable, and even though they're a shellfish, they're not filter feeders, so you don't have to worry about biotoxins and whatnot. You can harvest them just about any time. Granted, there are better times of the year where they're fatter. But after you harvest and eat all that sea urchin, you're left with a lot of shells, a lot of test. The official term for their shell is called test. And if you're really careful on how you extract the meat, you can collect the test intact. And so I played around with some light and how light reacts through the tests. I've created a handful of these lamps for close friends, but it's not something I regularly do. But one really cool experiment I did was just shining a light through it and seeing this kaleidoscope of light shining through all of the holes, and those holes are its pneumatic system. It's how it functions, right? Those of you that are familiar with sea stars and their tube feet, well, sea urchins are related, and they use the same pneumatic system. They also have a water intake or madreporite organelle that takes in water, and it's through all these little holes that the light are shining through that they operate their tube feet. I've also played with other forms, other medium. I've collaborated with another artist, Azurite of Azurite Designs. She's actually another artist in the Port Townsend Marine Science Center shop, a metal artist, and I've worked with her to electroplate some of these collections that I have. Just another way of preserving and appreciating the art forms of the sea. Last but not least, kind of paying homage to my love of surfing of the ocean, I worked with a local shaper, Chris Bauer of Bauer Surfboards out of Port Angeles, to come up with my own custom surfboard, one that I call the Fishy Fish. The shape of the board is a fish, and of course I've got my fish print up there. I even went as far as put one of my algae pressings on the bottom such that it looks like a piece of kelp washed up on my board and dried there. So people are always like, hey, there's something on your board. It's supposed to be there. And of course, I've played around with gyotaku and some of the fins, some of the surf fins that I really enjoy and like. Just my way of collecting things I like and sharing it. So in closing, I want to talk a little bit about my science, how that's turned into art and turned into conservation. Like I mentioned, this is an art hobby. I have a full-time job during the day, doing something that I really love doing and pursuing a mission that I truly believe in, working with a great crew. This is just an art hobby of mine, but I try my best to get my art out there, to share with others, to share love and appreciation of the ocean. And I try my best when I do that to do it in a way that helps provide and support conservation of the oceans. And so as Betsy has mentioned, I was the 2022 local artist featured in Sea Grant. They contracted with me to get some of my art on their annual swag for their donors up there. This last year in 2023, I was the featured artist for National Shell Fisheries Association's Pacific Coast section, where they contracted me to assemble this piece here, this montage of all a variety of West Coast shellfish as their conference swag, their sweaters and shirts for the conference. And I'll give another shout out to my partner who is a digital artist and helped me put that together. I've also provided pieces for various benefits and auctions for the Keta Foundation, that crab, for the Nisquallion Land Trust, the two pink salmon there. And most recently, I donated this crab art piece to the Pacific Northwest Crab Research Group for them to put on this thank you gift to their citizen science volunteers. And so I try my best to get my art to the people that will love and appreciate it, and in a way that helps support conservation. And so to that end, I'll tell you just about the only place besides directly from me to get my art is through the Marine Science Center shop. As most of you already know, all of their proceeds go to their non-profit education and conservation causes. And so this is a place where I feel really good about selling my art. You can find some of my original pieces there. You can find, if they still have them in stock, some of these shirts that you saw Betsy wearing. And I know they are in the works of printing another shirt with this rockfish as the main design on there. And so feel free to check them out. If you want to see some more of my work and some of my art, I don't really have a big online presence. I don't have an Etsy, I don't have a website, but I do have an Instagram. So you can find me at spearfisher there, at that QR code. And last but not least, I just really need to give a big shout out to my partner, my main supporter, my biggest fan, Jen Lee Light. Many of the photos you've seen were taken by her. A lot of the digital compositions and reproductions were done by her. And really, she's taught me a ton about art because she is really the artist in the household. And I couldn't have done any of this without her. So with that, thank you all, and I'll take any questions.
Hey, Nam. Hey. I was just wondering, have you ever experimented with different colored inks? Like when you print a kelp, have you ever tried with like golden ink or anything like that, or for the reds?
That's a really good question. And I assume you're talking about printing the gyotakus. I just bought some gold and silver ink So I'm really excited to play around with like making a shiny gold, really a silver fish on black and then gold eyes. I've thought about doing color. I've experimenting with adding color to my prints afterwards, but I really like the just contrast of them. But yes, I am going to work with those shiny colors. So. Thank you.
What kind of ink do you use?
Thank you. So I use acrylic ink. I don't use specifically fabric ink. I just use acrylic ink because that's what I found works for me. I'm always open to try different things. I found something that stuck. With a lot of my one-offs, my originals, not clothes, but like the pressings, the framed ones actually get Scotch guarded afterwards for staying power to help kind of keep it. But acrylic ink is the short answer. Traditionally, the gyotaku is done with sumi ink and rice paper, but I've just deviated and created my own process. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you to share a secret,
Oh, okay.
which is how do you make the eyes so realistic?
It's something that I only in the last year and a half really started experimenting with. And you know, really it's about light. That, you know, so much of art is about how light shows the piece, and in turn how that piece shows light. And so when it comes to the eyes, the thing to remember is that it's shiny, and if there's a source of light in the room somewhere, then that's going to show as a glare or a reflection. And if you keep that in mind, if you just, you know, to be honest, when I first started doing it, I did it pretty haphazardly, and the more haphazardly and randomly I did it, the more I actually liked it, because lighting is pretty random. And so, especially in that underwater scene, right? Here it's fixed, but yeah, it's just about adding a couple of glares here, and you'd be surprised what like a little white dot here and a white line there would do.
I just wanted to ask about the Somi ink and what is Somi ink? And I also was just curious about the sea urchin test little lamps that you make, because I've made one too, but they're so delicate. And I'm always worried about breaking it, and I'm wondering if you preserved it in any sort of way.
Yeah, well, I've broken many. But yeah, you know, it's just trial and error. I think for some of the lamps, and I haven't made a lamp for a long time. The last one I made was for my mom for Christmas like a year ago. I'm pretty sure I used what's that spray that kind of adds like a layer and kind of seals it a little bit. Some kind of polyurethane spray I've used. I've also used I can't remember. Shellac. So various ways to try to preserve it. As far as your first question with regards to the sumi ink, that's an ink out of Asia, traditionally made with charcoal. I believe they burn the heck out of charcoal and add tar to it, and it's a black natural ink. It just doesn't work for my medium because it's too runny. For paper, I think it works well. Yeah.
I'm curious, with all the time you've spent underwater, if you've seen some species come, some go, some show up that you've never seen before, and kind of especially with the algae.
Thank you. That's a great question. As much time I've spent underwater, I think it's a drop of water compared to the grand geological, biological scale, ecological scale of things. I hesitate to make any big assumptions about changes based on the limited experience I have of like maybe, locally here a decade or a little more than a decade. That's not long enough to really say with certainty any trend. Certainly there are boom and busts of any species. There are cycles that it goes through, and I do believe I am witnessing one of those. I was pretty shocked to go to one of my favorite dive sites this last year that in the past 3 to 4 years was a vibrant giant kelp macrocystis forest. In fact, it's where I took that video where we all took a breath together. I went back there this last summer and it was pretty bare. Now that could be due to storms. That could be due to different recruitment patterns. Again, I hesitate to make any major claims about that. There are great scientists people way smarter than me out there doing this research. In fact, Department of Natural Resources, their main kelp expert, Helen Berry, published a really great paper about the trend of kelp distribution in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. That came out 2 years ago. And she compared historical data, albeit in pretty patchy historical data with more recent data, and they didn't find any major trends over the last 100 years, although there are cycles of boom and bust throughout those years. That said, yeah, I definitely observe a lot, but I don't know if it's, a big storm that's come through or something bigger or more nefarious per se. That said, I will tell you that I'm hugely jealous of, when I talk to older folks around here that tell me back in the day we used to see this. Back in the day, the fish basically jumped in the boat. Granted that's anecdotal and whatnot, but it certainly seems like things have changed since back in the day. What's funny is part of my work in conservation and whatnot, I often have frustrated fisher people come approach me, and I get the frustration, and they say something like, well, back in the day, I used to be able to catch 4 salmon a day, and now it's not even open. And honestly, in the back of my mind, I think, well, maybe it's not open now because you caught 4 salmon a day back in the day. So, realities change, information change, and that's the one certainty of life, is that things will always change. And I don't know if what I've observed is long-term, short-term, or just a cyclical pattern.
Probably something like the bull kelp. You've got that big thick bladder. You're cheating, right? Are you cutting like a thin slice of it when you don't press that whole bulb?
Oh, that's a secret.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
No, it's a secret I am happy to share. Thank you for the question. In all seriousness, there are no secrets to my art. I'm more than happy to share it, because at the end of the day, the reason why I do it is to share it with people. I certainly don't do it to make money, and I'm an open book. In fact, I have led a handful of algae pressing workshops pre-pandemic, and I've been asked to give gyotaku workshops. I'm happy to share all that stuff. You guessed correctly, with the bull kelp, the thing with algae pressing, the key is it's a fight against mold. You have to dry that specimen as quickly as you can before it starts rotting and molding. And so I've found various methods to do that, including, for those of you who have done algae pressings, that in between each layer you have cardboard, you have blotting paper, you have fabric, towels, whatnot, everything you can to wick away that moisture. But one thing I do is I actually remove those layers every single day in the midst of my algae pressing season. I throw everything in the dryer and I put new stuff on every single day. And sometimes I have like a stack of like 30 press. And so that's like 90 pieces of fabric that I'm opening each and every single one up and throwing in the dryer and putting new ones on to speed up that drying process to fight rot. One of the other methods I do use for those big, chunky, substantial kelp is I do thin slice the back half of it. Even sometimes that's not enough. I actually, I want to give some credit to a friend and another artist and conservationist, Betsy Peabody of the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. I was inspired by one of her pieces where she thin sliced the bulb of the kelp and then laid it out. So it was from that I got the idea of like, okay, I'm going to start slicing anything that if I only need half of it to present, I don't need the back half, I don't need that huge bulb and all that organic matter there, wet and molding and whatnot. So, yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nam. This was fabulous and very informative and inspiring. So thank you all for coming.